Hello, I'm Constance Martin in Boston, Massachusetts, and this is Chapter 14 of Jane of Lantern Hill. Jane found that waiting for something pleasant was very different from waiting for something unpleasant. Mrs. Stanley would not have known her with the laughter and sparkle in her eyes. If the forenoon seemed long, it was only because she was in such a hurry to be with Dad again, and away from Aunt Irene. Aunt Irene was trying to pump her about grandmother and mother and life at 60 Gay. Jane was not going to be pumped, much to Aunt Irene's disappointment. Questioned she never so cleverly, Jane had a disconcerting yes or no for every question, and still more disconcerting silence for suggestive remarks that were disguised questions. "So your grandmother Kennedy is good to you, Janie?" "Very good," said Jane unflinchingly. Well, grandmother was good to her. There were St. Agatha's, and the music lessons, and the pretty clothes, the limousine, and the balanced meals as evidence. Aunt Irene had looked carefully at all her clothes. "She never had any use for your father, you know, Janie. I thought perhaps she might take her spite out on you. It was really she that made all the trouble between him and your mother." Jane said nothing. She would not talk about that secret bitterness to Aunt Irene. Aunt Irene gave up in disgust. "Dad came back at noon without his car, but with a horse and buggy. It's going to take all day to fix it. I'm borrowing Jed Carson's rig, and he'll take it back when he brings the car and Jane's trunk out tomorrow." "Did you ever have a buggy ride, my Jane?" "You're not going without your dinners," said Aunt Irene. Jane enjoyed that dinner, having eaten next to nothing ever since she left Toronto. She hoped Dad wouldn't think her appetite terrible. For all she knew, he was poor. That car hadn't looked like wealth, and another mouth to fill might be inconvenient. But Dad himself was evidently enjoying his dinner, especially that chocolate peppermint cake. Jane wished she knew how to make chocolate peppermint cake, but she made up her mind that she would never ask Aunt Irene how to make it. Aunt Irene made a fuss over Dad. She purred over him, actually purred. And Dad liked her purring and her honey-sweet phrases just as well as he had liked her cake. Jane saw that clearly. "It isn't really fair to the child to take her out to that Brookview boarding house of yours," said Aunt Irene. "Who knows but I'll get a house of my own for the summer," said Dad. "Do you think you could keep house for me, Jane?" "Yes," said Jane promptly. She could. She knew how a house should be kept, even if she had never kept one. There are people who are born knowing things. "Can you cook?" asked Aunt Irene, winking at Dad, as if over some delicious joke. Jane was pleased to see that Dad did not wink back, and he saved her the ordeal of replying. "Any descendant of my mother's can cook," he said. "Come, my Jane, put on thy beautiful garments and let's be on our way." As Jane came downstairs in her hat and coat, she could not help hearing Aunt Irene in the dining room. "She's got a secretive strain in her, Andrew, that I confess I don't like." "Knows how to keep her own counsel, eh?" said Dad. "It's more than that, Andrew. She's deep. Take my word for it, she's deep. Old Lady Kennedy will never be dead while she is alive. But she is a very dear little girl for all that, Andrew. We can't expect her to be faultless. And if there's anything I can do for her, you have only to let me know. Be patient with her, Andrew. You know she's never been taught how to love you." Jane fairly gritted her teeth. The idea of her having to be taught how to love Dad. It was funny. Jane's annoyance with Aunt Irene dissolved in a little chuckle, as low-pitched and impish as an owl's. "Do be careful of poison ivy," Aunt Irene called after them as they drove away. "I'm told there is so much of it in Brookview. Do take good care of her, Andrew." "You've got it wrong end foremost, Irene, like all women. Anyone could see with half an eye that Jane is going to take care of me." A blithe soul was Jane as they drove away. The glow at her heart went with her across the island. She simply could not believe that only a few hours had elapsed since she had been the most miserable creature in the world. It was jolly to ride in a buggy, just behind a little red mare, whose sleek hams Jane would have liked to bend forward and slap. She did not eat up the long red miles as a car would have done, but Jane did not want them eaten up. The road was full of lovely surprises. A glimpse of far-off hills that seemed made of opal dust. A whiff of wind that had been blowing over a clover field. Brooks that appeared from nowhere. and ran off into green shadowy woods where long branches of spicy fir hung over the laced water, great white cloud mountains towering up in the blue sky, a hollow of tipsy buttercups, a tidal river, unbelievably blue. Everywhere she looked there was something to delight her. Everything seemed just on the point of whispering a secret of happiness. And there was something else, the sea tang in the air. Jane sniffed it for the first time, sniffed again, drank it in. "Feel in my right-hand pocket," said Dad. Jane explored and found a bag of caramels. At 60 Gay, she was not allowed to eat candy between meals. But 60 Gay was 1,000 miles away. "We're neither of us much for talking, it seems," said Dad. "No, but I think we entertain each other very well," said Jane, as distinctly as she could with her jaws stuck together with caramel. Dad laughed. He had such a nice understanding laugh. "I can talk a blue streak when the spirit moves me," he said. "When it doesn't, I like people to let me be." "You're a girl after my own heart, Jane. I'm glad I was predestined to send for you. Irene argued against it, but I'm a stubborn dud, my Jane, when I take a notion into my noddle. It just occurred to me that I wanted to get acquainted with my daughter." Dad did not ask about Mother. Jane was thankful he did not, and yet she knew it was all wrong that he did not. It was all wrong that Mother had asked her not to speak of her to him. Oh, there were too many things all wrong, but one thing was indisputably and satisfyingly right. She was going to spend a whole summer with Dad, and they were here together, driving over a road which had a life of its own that seemed to be running through her veins like quicksilver. Jane knew that she had never been any place or in any company that suited her so well. The most delightful drive must end. "We'll soon be at Brookview," said Dad. "I've been living at Brookview this past year. It is still one of the quiet places of the earth. I've a couple of rooms over Jim Mead's store. Mrs. Jim Mead gives me my meals and thinks I'm a harmless lunatic because I write." "What do you write, Dad?" asked Jane, thinking of peaceful adjustment of international difficulties. "A little of everything, Jane. Stories, poems, essays, articles on all subjects. I even wrote a novel once, but I couldn't find a publisher. So I went back to my pot boilers. Behold a mute, inglorious Milton in your Dad. To you, Jane, I will confide my dearest dream. It is to write an epic on the life of Methuselah. What a subject! Here we are." Here was a corner where two roads crossed, and in the corner was a building, which was a store at one end and a dwelling place at the other. The store end was open to the road, but the house end was fenced off with a paling and a spruce hedge. Jane learned at once and forever the art of getting out of a buggy, and they went through a little white gate, with a black wooden decoy duck on one of its posts, and up a red walk edged with ribbon grass and big quahog shells. "Woof, woof," went a friendly little brown and white dog sitting on the steps. A nice gingery smell of hot cookies floated out of the door as an elderly woman came out, a trim body, wearing a white apron edged with 6-inch deep crochet lace, and with the reddest cheeks Jane had ever seen on anybody in her life. "Mrs. Mead, this is Jane," said Dad, "and now you see why I shall have to shave every morning after this." "Dear child," said Mrs. Mead and kissed her. Jane liked her kiss better than Aunt Irene's. Mrs. Mead at once gave Jane a slice of bread and butter and strawberry jam to stay her stomach till supper. It was wild strawberry jam, and Jane had never tasted wild strawberry jam in her life before. The supper table was spread in a spotless kitchen where all the big windows were filled with flowering geraniums and begonias with silver-spotted leaves. "I like kitchens," thought Jane. Through another door that opened into a garden was a far-away view of green pastures to the south. The table in the center of the room was covered with a gay red and white checked cloth. There was a fat, squat little bean pot full of golden brown beans before Mr. Mead, who gave Jane a liberal helping, besides a big square of fluffy cornmeal cake. Mr. Mead looked very much like a cabbage in spectacles and flying jibs, but Jane liked him. Nobody found fault with Jane for things done or left undone. Nobody made her feel silly and crude and always in the wrong. When she finished her Johnny cake, Mr. Mead put another slice on her plate without even her asking if she wanted it. Eat all you like, but pocket nothing, he told her solemnly. The brown and white dog sat beside her, looking up with hungry, hopeful eyes. Nobody took any notice when Jane fed him bits of Johnny cake. Mr. and Mrs. Meade did most of the talking. It was all about people Jane had never heard of, but somehow she liked to listen. When Mrs. Meade said in a solemn voice that poor George Baldwin was very ill with an ulcer in his stomach, Jane's eyes and Dad's danced to each other, though their faces remained as solemn as Mrs. Meade's. Jane felt warm and pleasant all over. It was jolly having someone to share a joke with. Fancy laughing with your eyes at anyone in 60 gay. She and Mother exchanged glimmers, but they never dared laugh. The east was paling to moonrise when Jane went to bed in Mrs. Meade's spare room. The bureau and washstand were very cheap, the bed an iron one enameled in white, and the floor painted brown. But there was a glorious hooked rug of roses and ferns and autumn leaves on it. The prim starched lace curtains were as white as snow. The wallpaper was so pretty, silver daisy clusters on a creamy ground with circles of pale blue ribbon around them. And there was a huge scarlet geranium with scented velvety leaves on a stand before one of the windows. There was something friendly about the room. Jane slept like a top, and was up and down in the morning when Mrs. Meade was lighting the kitchen fire. Mrs. Meade gave Jane a big fat doughnut to stay her stomach till breakfast, and sent her out into the garden to wait till Dad came down. It lay in the silence of the dewy morning. The wind was full of wholesome country smells. The little flower beds were edged with blue forget-me-nots, and in one corner was a big clump of early dark red peonies. Violets and plots of red and white daisies grew under the parlor windows. In a near field, cows were cropping gold-green grass, and a dozen little fluffy chicks were running about. A tiny yellow bird was tilting on the spirea spray. The brown and white dog came out and followed Jane about. A funny two-wheeled cart, such as Jane had never seen before, went on by the road, and the driver, a lank youth in overalls, waved to her, as to an old friend. Jane promptly waved back with what was left of her doughnut. How blue and high the sky was. Jane liked the country sky. P.E. Island is a lovely place, thought Jane, not at all grudgingly. She picked a pink cabbage rose and shook the dew from it all over her face. Fancy washing your face with a rose. And then she remembered how she had prayed that she might not come here. I think, said Jane decidedly, that I should apologize to God.